we find ourselves today. Players has dropped to a critically low level. Today, more than ever, it is important to understand how we got here. However, for at least the last 200 years, the countries of the West have had one single explanation for any such problems, and it is also the universal solution, and that is to blame Russia for everything. But let's look at the facts. In the late 1980s, the international community had reason to hope that the Cold War, with its arms race and the threat of a major confrontation between superpowers, was over. Many experts seriously argued back then that bloc confrontation was also a thing of the past. All of this happened first and foremost because first the USSR and then Russia radically changed course in response to the promises and assurances of the West. Back then, we were assured that NATO would not seek to gain any unilateral advantages from the changed situation in Europe or create new dividing lines there. We were promised an equal partnership based on trust, transparency, and mutual consideration of security concerns, which also implied a promise not to expand NATO to the east. From records of conversations and memoirs of Western politicians, it has become clear that we were blatantly and shamelessly deceived, and that neither the US nor their allies intended to fulfill any of those promises. No sort of equal partnership was even being considered. Moreover, the countries of the West took advantage of our economic and political challenges during the transition period and declared Russia the loser in the Cold War. And the loser, in their understanding, cannot lay claim to anything. NATO member states almost instantly forgot their promises not to build up a military presence in Europe and not to move any military infrastructure closer to Russia's borders. Mr. President, for 30 years, we have been patiently trying to reach an agreement with NATO on the principles of equal and indivisible security in the Euro-Atlantic region. However, our proposals constantly met either with cynical lies or attempts to exert pressure and blackmail. At the same time, NATO continued to inexorably expand, bringing its military infrastructure closer and closer to our borders, including by the deployment of missile defense systems and offensive weapons. All of this created a real threat to the national security of our country. Our president warned about this back in 2007 during the Munich Security Conference, where he urged NATO to abandon this dangerous path of confrontation. Unfortunately, those warnings were not heeded by the West. On the contrary, in 2008, the US and their NATO allies pushed the Georgian authorities of the time to embark on a crude military venture against South Ossetian Russian peacekeepers, something that led to catastrophic consequences for Georgia. At the same time, the United States deliberately dismantled key elements of the global arms control system, which for decades had maintained a strategic balance and allowed to prevent armed confrontation. Back in 2001, Washington announced its unilateral withdrawal from the ABM treaty under the far-fetched pretext that it was allegedly outdated and not in line with modern realities. In 2019, the United States also unilaterally withdrew from the INF treaty, which the Secretary General had once called an invaluable tool that can prevent nuclear war. In order to avoid a new round of confrontation, we proposed a mutual moratorium on the deployment of such missiles to the US and NATO. We even undertook a unilateral obligation not to be the first to place systems banned by an INF treaty in those regions where no similar American-made weapons were deployed. But our proposal to join this moratorium was rejected by the US and its NATO allies. It is also symptomatic in this context that the United States continues to refuse to ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT. In terms of the Euro-Atlantic space itself, we have done everything possible for many years to maintain the viability of the conventional arms control regime. Russia was the initiator of negotiations on adapting the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, and it ratified the agreement on the adaptation of that treaty that would allow to take new strategic realities in Europe into account. However, the US and its NATO allies, and NATO was by the mid-2000s expanding at full speed, refused to ratify this agreement. The NATO recruits of the 2000s, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovenia, Albania, and Croatia, refused to accede to the CFE treaty in principle. All this deprived the treaty of any sort of political or military meaning. In 2020, the United States essentially signed the death warrant of another cornerstone confidence-building agreement in the Euro-Atlantic region. They unilaterally withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty. I want to stress that dismantling of each of these arms-controlled instruments was the result of deliberate actions by the United States, who have essentially razed the existing architecture in this area to the ground. In December of last year, we made one last attempt to save the European security system, which was dying under the blows of Western countries. Russia put forth a set of proposals to the US and NATO on confidence building and security measures in the Euro-Atlantic region. We made a proposal to the US to conclude an agreement on legally binding mutual security assurances that would take into account the concerns of both sides and would revert the situation in Russia-NATO relations back to 1997 when the Russia-NATO Founding Act was signed. A similar agreement was transmitted to NATO. These are public documents that anyone can access if they wish. Our proposals were based on the principle of common indivisible security. It presumes that states should not strengthen their security at the expense of other states. This is a fundamental principle of civilized international relations. It is reflected in a number of foundational OSCE documents, including the OSCE Istanbul Charter for European Security of 1999 and reaffirmed in the Astana Declaration Summit of the 2009 OSCE Summit, underlines agreements between Russia and NATO. Yet our American colleagues chose not to reaffirm this principle, referring to the sanctity of the open door policy for NATO. Thus, all our proposals for security assurances were rejected by the US and NATO. They simply refused to discuss them on the merits and for the upteenth time in history chose escalation over a diplomatic settlement. As a result, a crisis has broken out in the European region with a global reach and quite literally historic consequences. The reason why the collective West has been purposefully destroying the system of European security all these years is that the proven system of checks and balances, the balance of interests, has ceased to meet its hegemonic aspirations. There is a temptation to subject the world to their dictate and force the entire globe to live and work according to the prescriptions of the West. Collective security, however, is incompatible with coercion and hegemony and the desire to undermine any alternative sovereign paths of development to keep countries and peoples in the grip of a colonial order. All possible means are being used to maintain this: gross interference in the internal affairs of states, coups d'etat, threats, blackmail, economic coercion, and inciting conflicts. In recent years, we have also seen dirty information campaigns based on lies and the presumption of one's own innocence. Truth and facts do not play any roles in this context for them because leading Western media and PR agencies are working hard to tarnish the opponent. Just like Georgia in its time, Ukraine was sacrificed in this confrontation with Russia, and the West set up an anti-people and anti-constitutional and Russophobic regime in the country. Today, the US and its allies is pumping heavy weapons into Kiev and otherwise using every means possible to prolong the conflict in Ukraine, a conflict that began in 2014 after the Maidan regime bombarded the inhabitants of the southeast of the country with explosives and shells, relegating the Ukrainian people to nothing more than cannon fodder. Contrary to their own declared values, Western countries cynically turn a blind eye to the spread of neo-Nazi ideologies, massacres of residents in the Donbass region, and violations of international humanitarian law by the armed forces of Ukraine and national battalions. In recent weeks, Western patrons of Ukraine are essentially helping Kiev in its attempts of nuclear blackmail while ignoring the shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant by Ukrainian armed forces. At the Security Council meeting convened by Russia last week on this topic, not a single Western delegation found the resolve to call a spade and to urge Kiev to stop these dangerous actions that could lead to a nuclear catastrophe on the European continent. We requested another emergency meeting in connection with the ongoing provocations of the Ukrainian armed forces against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The United States and its allies are acting in the same reckless and provocative manner in Asia and Africa. Their destructive policy in the Asia-Pacific region has recently noticeably intensified. They are trying to impose bloc thinking on the states located there, to form aggressive military political alliances such as AUKUS, to drive a wedge between countries that have effective mechanisms for resolving contentious issues and force them to abandon the concept of Asian neutrality, which helped them to protect their own interests during the Cold War. The reckless American scheme involving Taiwan is proceeding in the same vein. We see this carefully planned provocation as a brazen demonstration of disrespect for the sovereignty of other countries and for the United States' own international obligations. We have to recognize that the Asia-Pacific region has generally become part of a purposeful, intentional strategy by the U.S. to destabilize the situation in those regions of the world where there are states pursuing their own independent policies. Mr. President, the 10th Review Conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is currently being held in New York. It is meant to bring the international community together in implementing its provisions. And even here, Western countries are politicizing work on the final document, putting their geopolitical interests in punishing Russia above the collective need to strengthen global security. In the context of what amounts to sabotage of the global security architecture by the collective West, Russia continues to do everything possible to keep at least its key vitally important elements afloat. On our initiative, in February 2021, the Russian-American Strategic Offensive Arms Treaty was extended by a further 5 years. We took the initiative to reaffirm the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought in the joint statement of the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapons states, which was adopted on January 3rd of this year. That statement also emphasizes the need to prevent not only a nuclear confrontation, but any military clash between nuclear powers. It is imperative for all signatories to the statement to demonstrate their commitment to those provisions in action. In principle, we remain open to cooperation to reduce tensions, stop the arms race, and minimize strategic risks. However, this requires our Western colleagues to be interested in this as well, and so far we're not seeing such interest on their part. Reducing global tensions, overcoming threats and risks in the political and military sphere is possible only by strengthening the multipolar system built on international law, the principles of the UN Charter, and the sovereign equality of states. This is the only true and effective alternative to hegemony and the right of might. We are ready to actively participate in joint efforts with like-minded partners to build a truly democratic world in which the rights of all nations would be upheld, their security interests would be ensured, and cultural and civilizational diversity would be guaranteed. This is important to do despite the fierce opposition of the US and its allies. Mr. President, today, before our very eyes, the outlines of a new world order are being formed. More and more states are choosing the path of sovereign, political, economic, and civilizational developments and rejecting standard templates and recipes imposed by the West. The West, however, is ready to do anything to preserve its hegemony. That is what Ukraine was sacrificed for and turned into a firing range for proxy war with Russia until the last Ukrainian standing. We hope that the actions of the West in this country have opened the eyes of many in the world to the true underpinnings of the crises that grip our planet. What is happening with Ukraine now and the behavior of NATO on the European continent over the last 30 years in general is a lesson for the whole world. Do you think that the US and its allies will behave differently in other parts of the world? History has shown that this is not so. Therefore, do not ask for whom the bell tolls today. It tolls for you. Thank you.
Thanks for watching.